The alien ships descended without warning, casting massive shadows across the Earth's cities. Their precision was flawless, their forces overwhelming. In a matter of hours, humanity's defenses crumbled. The aliens, towering and covered in shimmering armor, stormed through towns and cities, subduing any resistance with terrifying ease. In a small, quiet village far from the urban chaos, an elderly man sat on his porch, watching the destruction unfold in the distance. His face, lined with age and experience, showed no panic, no fear. His name was John, and despite the chaos around him, he remained still, sipping tea as though nothing extraordinary was happening. The aliens approached, scanning the area. One of them, larger and more imposing than the rest, barked an order in its harsh, guttural language. A few others moved forward, their weapons aimed at John. They expected him to run, to plead, to beg. But he did none of those things. John looked up at them, his eyes calm, and simply placed his teacup down. The lead alien sneered, its voice filled with disdain. "Is this what humanity has left? A fragile, withered shell?" The others joined in the mocking, their haughty voices echoing in the village's empty streets. They grabbed John by the arms, their grips rough and uncaring. Yet, despite their strength and the coldness of their touch, John offered no resistance. He simply allowed them to take him, as though this were all part of a plan only he understood. As they dragged him onto their sleek, hovering transport, the aliens couldn't help but feel disappointed. Where was the fight? The defiance they had come to expect from these humans? What they had captured was nothing more than an old man, his time long past. Surely, they thought, this would be no more than a routine interrogation, a formality before they discarded him. They took him aboard their colossal starship, locking him in a cell far more secure than anything John could have imagined. The room was sealed with layers of alien technology, force fields, reinforced walls, security drones watching his every move. The kind of prison that, to the aliens, seemed utterly inescapable for any human, let alone one of John's age. The aliens continued their mockery. They taunted him through the intercom, ridiculing his age, his perceived frailty. "What could you possibly offer us?" they sneered. "Your time is over, old man." But John remained silent, his gaze steady, his thoughts distant. He wasn't rattled by their insults. He had seen worse, fought tougher battles. The aliens didn't know who they had captured, not yet. There was no need to respond to their taunts. In their arrogance, they assumed he was powerless, just like every other human they had encountered. But John knew differently. Behind his quiet demeanor lay a history of warfare, of battles fought on distant worlds. He had once commanded fleets, orchestrated defenses that had held off invasions far more terrifying than these arrogant creatures could imagine. But those days were long past, or so the world believed. After the last great war, John had chosen to disappear, to live out his days in peace, hidden from the chaos that he had once been so deeply entrenched in. To the aliens, he was just an old man. But to those who knew the truth, he was a war hero, a strategist whose mind was sharper than any weapon they could wield. The cell's walls hummed with energy, the alien technology thrumming with a kind of quiet menace. To the aliens, this was the pinnacle of security. They had used it to imprison countless enemies, none of whom had ever escaped. John, however, was not like any of their previous captives. His experience, his knowledge of war, his ability to think several steps ahead, all of it was still there, hidden beneath the wrinkles and the slow movements of an elderly man. The aliens didn't see it. They didn't need to, John thought. Let them underestimate him. That would make what came next all the more satisfying. As the alien guards left, the cell door closing behind them with a mechanical hiss, John allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. They had no idea what was coming. The interrogation they planned was, to them, a formality. To John, it was the beginning of their undoing. John leaned back against the cold wall of his cell, his eyes scanning the room with the calm precision of someone who had seen far worse. The walls, though sleek and metallic, hummed with a faint energy field, a security measure, no doubt, but nothing he hadn't encountered before. Every part of the cell, Every device, every guard movement, it was all part of the system. And systems, John knew, could always be broken. He noted the security cameras embedded in the corners, their unblinking red lights tracking his every move. But they weren't invincible. No system ever was. In his pocket, John felt the thin wire he'd hidden from the aliens, a small piece of a jacket lining they hadn't bothered to inspect. They were too confident, too certain that no human could outthink them. That arrogance would be their downfall. The guards outside his cell moved in regular patterns, walking the same routes at the same intervals. John had memorized their shifts within the first few hours of his capture. He could hear them muttering as they passed, their voices echoing faintly through the walls. It was always the same sneering tone, dismissive, mocking. They believed they had locked away an old man past his prime, a relic from a dying world. Let them think that. John's thoughts drifted back to the war, long before Earth had faded from the galactic spotlight. The years of interplanetary combat, the countless skirmishes against advanced alien civilizations, none of that had ever truly left him. He remembered the first time they had encountered technology similar to this, the energy fields, the layered defenses. Back then, they had been outnumbered, outgunned, but never outsmarted. John had seen to that. His fingers twitched slightly as he thought through the steps. Disable the cameras first, make them think nothing had changed. Small disruptions, minor enough to be overlooked, would be the key. He had learned that lesson well in the war. Never give the enemy reason to panic until it was too late for them to stop you. Carefully, he bent the wire in his pocket, just enough to form a tiny hook. His movements were slow, methodical, like someone who had all the time in the world. The cameras still tracked him, but the guards weren't watching closely. To them, John was an afterthought. It took only a few seconds to pry open the small panel near his bed, exposing the circuits behind it. He worked quickly, his hands steady, despite their age. With a few careful adjustments, the cameras in his cell flickered, then powered down. No alarms went off. Perfect. John lay back on the bed, feigning exhaustion, letting his breath become shallow. He knew the routine by now. The guards would check in soon, expecting him to be as quiet and subdued as ever. And when they did, he'd be ready. Sure enough, the door slid open a few minutes later. One of the guards entered, glancing at John with mild disinterest. The alien's heavy footfalls echoed in the room as it moved to check the cameras, oblivious to the subtle change. John let out a low groan, weak and ragged, catching the guard's attention. The guard turned toward him, its expression one of faint amusement. "Not feeling well, human?" it sneered, stepping closer to the bed. John gave a slight, unconvincing nod, playing the part of the helpless old man. "Figures," the guard muttered. "You humans don't last long in these cells." John coughed weakly, drawing the guard even nearer. It leaned in, close enough for John to catch a glimpse of the control device hanging from its belt, a simple touchpad that controlled the cell's security. They really had underestimated him. Feigning a slight tremor in his hand, John reached out as though asking for help. The guard snorted, shaking its head. "Pathetic," it muttered, but leaned just close enough for John to slip the small wire from his jacket into the device's interface. A quick flick of his wrist, and the device malfunctioned, sending a brief signal disruption across the cell. The guard didn't even notice. It took a step back, satisfied that the human was no threat. "Try not to die too soon," it mocked, before leaving the room. John sat up slowly, watching as the door sealed shut again. The device was now under his control, its systems responding to his inputs, though the aliens were none the wiser. That was the first step. Subtle disruptions would go unnoticed at first, but he had time. He'd let them think they were still in control, while he unraveled everything around them. The next few days passed in a similar rhythm. John kept to himself, maintaining the appearance of frailty. He moved slowly, pretended to be confused, even spoke in a wavering voice when addressed by the guards. All the while, he learned. Every passing conversation between the guards revealed a little more about the ship, its layout, its systems, its routines. The guards weren't cautious around him. They believed their technology would do all the work, that an old man posed no threat. John asked them seemingly harmless questions, small, casual inquiries about the ship's structure, the shifts they worked, and where certain corridors led. The guards were eager to talk, their arrogance leading them to share more than they should. John listened carefully, piecing together a mental map of the ship's layout. He noticed something else too. The more he subtly manipulated their conversations, the more discord he began to sense among them. The guards, like all soldiers, had their complaints. Minor grumbles about leadership, the strict routines, the lack of respect from their superiors. John knew how to fan those flames. He dropped small, well-timed comments, just enough to stoke the underlying frustrations without drawing suspicion. The small disruptions began to take effect. The guards grew more complacent, more careless, assuming their captive was harmless. John's slow, deliberate actions went unnoticed. A malfunction here, a broken system there, nothing too large, nothing too obvious. But it was enough. The ship was a finely tuned machine, and John was starting to throw sand into the gears. Soon, they would realize that everything wasn't as secure as they thought. But by then, it would be too late. John sat in the shadows of his cell, knowing the time had come to act. The guards' routines had become predictable, their arrogance blinding them to the small, seemingly insignificant failures in their security systems. He had spent days planting those seeds, setting up the conditions for his escape. Now, with the power disruption he had subtly triggered, everything was in place. The hum of the energy field surrounding his cell wavered, just a flicker, but long enough for John to slip through. He moved swiftly and silently, his steps precise. Years of military training had taught him that victory often depended on patience and precision. He wasn't in a hurry. He couldn't afford to be. The corridors were dimly lit, the emergency lights casting long shadows on the walls. John knew the ship's layout by now, pieced together from overheard conversations and subtle probing questions. He moved through the ship like a ghost, avoiding patrols, his senses honed to detect the faintest hint of movement or sound. His first target was a guard stationed at a junction just ahead. The alien stood lazily, its weapons slung carelessly over its shoulder. They weren't expecting trouble, certainly not from a human, and especially not from the old man they had mocked just days before. John approached from behind, silently removing the guard with a swift, practiced motion. The alien slumped to the floor, unconscious before it could react. John took the guard's weapon, a sleek energy rifle far more advanced than anything he had used in the past. But the basics of combat never changed, no matter how fancy the tech. He adjusted the rifle's settings, then quickly dragged the alien's body into a nearby maintenance closet. No need to leave evidence, at least not yet. He continued down the hall, knowing exactly where he needed to go. The control room. If he could disable the ship's internal sensors, he'd have the freedom to move without triggering alarms. The aliens, so confident in their technology, had left several critical systems vulnerable. John had seen this kind of hubris before. He wasn't surprised. Reaching the control room, John slipped inside and made quick work of the guards there. A few precise strikes, a moment of hacking into the alien consoles, and the ship's sensors were down. The lights flickered, and a soft hum filled the air as systems began to malfunction. It was a small victory, but it would give him the time he needed to move freely. John wasn't here just to escape. He was here to send a message, to remind the aliens that humans weren't as weak as they thought. He moved deeper into the ship, taking out guards with a mix of guerrilla tactics and the aliens' own weapons. His actions were deliberate, calculated. He struck quickly, leaving no trace before moving on to the next target. Each encounter with the aliens became easier as he used their own arrogance against them. They didn't expect one man, especially one as old as John, to pose any real threat. That was their mistake. He dismantled their defenses piece by piece, always staying a step ahead of their response teams. At one point, John found himself in a maintenance corridor leading to the ship's ventilation system. A perfect opportunity. He climbed into the vents, navigating the maze-like tunnels with the same calm efficiency that had carried him through countless battles in his past. Through the grates, He could see groups of aliens rushing below, searching for him in vain. They still hadn't figured out the scale of their problem. In the dim light of the vents, John paused, hacking into one of the alien terminals he had accessed earlier. He disabled a few more security systems and rerouted power from critical areas, ensuring that the ship's most important functions were now his to manipulate. The ship's energy grid flickered again, throwing parts of the vessel into darkness. The aliens were starting to panic. He could hear their voices growing more frantic as they realized something was terribly wrong. Their prisoner was no longer a helpless old man. He had become a force of chaos they couldn't contain. The irony wasn't lost on John. Their technology, their sense of superiority, it was all being used against them, and they were powerless to stop it. John dropped from the vent system into a storage room, quickly scavenging parts from alien equipment. He assembled a makeshift explosive, small but potent, then set it near a vital power relay. He moved swiftly to the next section, planting traps and sabotaging systems as he went. The ship was becoming a maze of hazards, and the aliens were walking into every one of them. In the control centers, alarms were blaring. John overheard snatches of panicked conversations as he passed hidden behind walls or vents. The aliens were starting to understand. This wasn't just one human escaping, this was a full-blown crisis. John was systematically dismantling their ship from the inside, and they had no way of stopping him. He reached the armory next, a room filled with weapons far more advanced than anything John had seen in his prime. He smiled grimly, grabbing a few key items, repurposing them for his next move. There was no satisfaction in what he was doing, just the cold determination of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. This was war, just like the old days. And in war, you did whatever it took to win. As he moved through the ship, John's mind returned to the purpose behind his actions. It wasn't just about surviving. It wasn't even about winning this particular battle. It was about reminding these aliens, and anyone else who might try something similar, that humanity was not to be underestimated. That even in their elders, the spirit of defiance and resilience burned strong. John had seen too many civilizations rise and fall, too many battles fought and lost, to let this be any different. He would teach these aliens a lesson they would never forget. By the time they realized who they were truly dealing with, it would be far too late. Their systems were failing, their soldiers demoralized, and their arrogance shattered. The ship's corridors echoed with confusion and fear. John pressed forward, relentless and focused. His escape was inevitable now, but more than that, he was leaving behind a trail of destruction and chaos that would ensure the aliens remembered this day for the rest of their lives. This was no longer their ship, it was his battlefield. The ship's systems were failing faster than even John had expected. He had planned for chaos, but the sheer scale of it was staggering. Lights flickered, alarms blared, and the once pristine corridors were filled with confusion. Alien soldiers rushed in every direction, unsure of what had gone wrong, oblivious to the fact that their doom was being orchestrated by the very human they had dismissed as harmless. John moved through the chaos, calm and focused. He had done enough damage to cripple the ship, but he wasn't done yet. There were still others. He had overheard guards discussing the human prisoners held in various parts of the ship, captured during the invasion. Now was the time to free them. He made his way to the detention block, avoiding patrols with the ease of someone who had spent decades evading far more dangerous enemies. When he arrived, he found the prisoners in a state of fear and confusion, huddled together in their cells. Many of them were injured, exhausted, and utterly broken in spirit. They had been treated as weak, as insignificant. Just like he had. John bypassed the locks with the alien device he had taken from a guard earlier, and one by one the cells slid open. The prisoners looked up in disbelief as he entered, his presence unexpected and strangely reassuring. At first, there was silence. These were civilians, not soldiers. They had no reason to believe that one man, an old man at that, could change their fate. But John had always been a leader. He had led entire battalions in the darkest hours of war. He knew how to inspire hope, even in those who had none left. "You're not prisoners anymore," John said, his voice steady. You're free. But we're not done yet. They stared at him, uncertain. A few of the younger ones, perhaps, still had some spark of defiance left, but most were too beaten down to believe that freedom was even possible. We're taking this ship, John continued, meeting their eyes. I've already crippled their systems. They're disorganized, panicked. We have the advantage now. But I can't do it alone. I need your help. A murmur rippled through the group. Some began to stand, their faces showing the first glimmers of hope. John knew that they were scared, but he also knew that fear could be turned into strength if given the right direction. He showed them the alien weapons he had taken, explaining in simple terms how they worked, how to use them to their advantage. These people might not have had military training, but that didn't matter. John's plan was simple, effective. They didn't need to win a war, they just needed to outsmart their captors for long enough to seize control of the ship. I've been sabotaging their systems from the inside, John explained. We've already got them on the run. All we need to do now is finish the job. One of the prisoners, a younger man, stepped forward. But they're stronger than us. There are more of them. How can we possibly win? John's eyes locked with his, steady and unflinching. Because they think they've already won. That's their weakness. They think we're weak. But we're human, and we don't give up. The man nodded, slowly at first, but then with more certainty. Others followed, picking up weapons, ready to fight. John gave them quick instructions, organizing them into small groups. He had done this before, led outnumbered forces against superior enemies. This was no different. The plan was simple: use the confusion John had already created to their advantage. The aliens were still scrambling to figure out what had gone wrong, and in that chaos, the prisoners would strike. John led them through the ship's corridors, avoiding direct confrontation until the time was right. As they moved, John could see the fear in their eyes, but he could also see determination. They weren't soldiers, but they had something even more powerful: the will to survive. And with John guiding them, they moved with purpose. The final showdown came at the heart of the ship, where the alien commander and his top officers had retreated, trying to regain control of the situation. John knew they would be there, trying to reorganize their forces, but it was too late. He had dismantled too much. The systems were too far gone, the chain of command too fractured to recover. John and his group burst into the command center, taking the aliens by surprise. The commander, a hulking figure with cold, calculating eyes, sneered as he saw John at the head of the group. You think you've won, human? The commander spat. You're nothing. A relic. A weak, dying species. John didn't flinch. He had heard worse before. He had fought enemies who underestimated him his entire life, and he had survived every single one of them. You don't understand humans, John said, his voice calm, steady. You never did. The battle was swift. The aliens, though physically stronger, were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. John's tactics were flawless, his people working together with the precision of a well-trained unit. The aliens, thrown off by the sudden uprising, couldn't keep up. Within minutes, the command center was under human control. The alien commander, beaten and humiliated, lay at John's feet, still unable to comprehend what had happened. How? He gasped. How did one old man? John looked down at him, the weight of all his years of experience behind his gaze. It was never about strength, he said quietly. It was about underestimating us. That's why you've lost. With the ship under human control, the remaining aliens were forced to surrender. John's small band of prisoners had grown into a force of their own, united by a shared belief in survival, in defiance. The once invincible alien ship was now in the hands of the very people they had thought too weak to resist. As the aliens were escorted away in defeat, John stood quietly, watching the chaos he had caused settle into a strange, victorious calm. He didn't care about glory. He didn't need recognition. He had done what needed to be done, as he always had. But word would spread. It always did. The legend of the elderly human who had single-handedly turned the tide of an alien invasion would become a symbol across the galaxy. It would serve as a reminder to anyone who thought humans were weak, that no matter their age or appearance, they were not to be underestimated. John, ever the soldier, simply walked away. He had won. And that was enough.